Hello, and welcome to our post media panel on the Ontario election with a focus today on housing. And it's probably one of the hottest issues heading into the election campaign. But in recent years, the cost of buying a home and how much supply there is has been a hot issue in general, right? Even going back to their most recent federal campaign as well. So, without hesitation, let me introduce our panel. First of all, Megan Stacey, City Hall reporter with the London Free Press. Hello, Megan. Taylor Blewett, housing reporter with the Ottawa Citizen and Ottawa Sun. Hello, Taylor. And finally, Councillor Ralston King, Ottawa City Councillor, and he's also a member of the Planning Advisory Committee in the City of Ottawa. Hello, Councillor King.
Hello, it's great to join you.
Let's start off right off the top with the assertion I made, I guess. Is housing the most important issue in the Ontario election campaign? Let's start with you, Megan.
John, I think it depends who you're talking to, but I don't meet very many people who aren't bringing this up, in the first, second, or third priority. And I think you can kind of tie this into other concerns, rising cost of living, inflation, all those sorts of related issues. You're hearing people talk about the price of housing, the unaffordability, and, even people who are securely housed are thinking about their kids, their grandkids, other folks and other generations who won't be able to buy, who are dealing with skyrocketing rents. So I think it's safe to say it's right up there. You're also looking at a lot of party platforms that have some pretty ambitious goals, right? This 1.5 million housing goal is showing up in a lot of platforms. So I think it's fair to say, the parties are recognizing too that this is a super top priority for a lot of voters.
Taylor, what are you seeing on the provincial campaign right now? Is housing, the importance of housing, being reflected in the party arguments, the party platforms?
Yeah, I think you take a look at the party platforms, and it tells you how important housing is to voters this election. I think people are they're demanding really that both the increasing challenges around affordability of home ownership as well as rental insecurity, people who are struggling with lack of access to non-market housing options for those lower income renters who really do need it, supportive housing, all of that. It's a smorgasbord in some of these in most of these platforms, actually, like pages on pages on pages of housing related pledges. The exception here are the PCs. They haven't released a platform per se. I did reach out to them to try to clarify, is that your intention? Do you intend to? And they just said, we put out this budget. We have the budget that was released in the spring. There are some housing related promises in there. We're going to be building 1.5 million homes. All the parties agree they want to be building 1.5 million homes. And we did see as well the PCs brought forward their act in the spring that was making changes. They were making a lot of housing related changes. So they're really kind of campaigning on their record and continuing to do a lot of the things that they said they were going to be doing while in government.
Councillor King, when you look at these party platforms, are you examining them through the lens of a municipal councillor, or how do you read what the parties are putting forward?
Well, the key for municipalities has been housing over the last 10, 20, 30 years. And now we're really seeing the challenges emerge. I think that cities have been very clear that there needs to be investment in housing, especially public housing. And there are many elements that are outside of the control of cities, which frustrates us because we hear sometimes criticism from senior levels of government that cities are moving too slow in terms of approvals. Well, we can only go so far and so fast when we're looking at things such as the building code, etc. But in terms of the wider housing environment, we know that many elements, especially microeconomic elements, are beyond our control. and we heard a few of them today. Inflation, the challenge of low interest rates for nearly 2 decades, really ensuring that there has been an exponential increase in house prices, consolidation of rental stock by private enterprise. So it's a very challenging environment where we've seen for middle income people massive asset appreciation in housing. But what we also have seen over the last several decades is a lack of real investment in public housing. And so that really does exacerbate the challenges that cities are having. We have aging housing stock, and in Ottawa, aging housing stock that had been built by the province many decades ago, downloaded and offset to cities without the proper resources to maintain that housing stock. So we're seeing that housing stock at end of life. And we also have a challenge of thousands and thousands and thousands of people on waiting lists who need to be addressed, especially lower income people who need below market rent. And so, what we need are real investments in public housing, which haven't been made over the past several decades, so that we can go on a housing a building boom in our cities and ensure that we reduce waiting lists and we make housing more affordable, especially for people who can least afford it.
Yeah, maybe we could talk about the impact to municipalities. And Megan, I'm sure in London this is a hot topic of conversation. If it's anything like Ottawa, the effect of provincial regulations, provincial planning regulations at the local level. So maybe Megan, tell us about the situation in London and what I guess London City Hall is often looking for in terms of planning regulations or non-regulations from the province.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you asked it that way, John, because, here in London, we've got a real push to increase density, right? And I think a lot of cities like London, and even cities that aren't like London, bigger cities, this is the question, right? We can all agree there's a supply issue. And I think in a lot of cases, there's some agreement that we've got to tackle the urban sprawl issue, right? And so if you're trying to check these boxes and you're trying to build more housing, and we all agree, that's something that we need, we've got to address the supply issue, you're left with building up higher density, right? And so I think it's really interesting. That's obviously a pillar of the official plan here in London. How that plays out in reality and at City Hall, maybe not quite so clear, not quite so smooth sailing all the time. But I think it's really interesting to see in a number of the party platforms, you're seeing this recognition of we've got to have more density, right? So that's everything from the Greens suggesting that first-time homebuyers should have an easier time creating an additional rental unit right in their home. I mean, that's a form of density right there, right? And all the way on the other side, the NDP is suggesting that they're going to get rid of exclusionary zoning policies. A lot of focus among a couple of platforms on that idea of inclusionary zoning, forcing more density and forcing affordable units in all buildings or all development of a certain size. So I think that's a real good way that we can start tackling this issue. I do think, how that plays out in reality can sometimes be a little bit different than the campaign promises, right? Density is a really attractive thing on paper. And if Ottawa is anything like London, when we actually start to see density in neighborhoods, when the rubber hits the road, you see a little bit maybe some more trouble accepting that. So to me, that's going to be an interesting question here in London is who's accepting that, who's building that, who's willing to do that, and how do we see, all these promises.
Yeah, and in a second, I want to come to Councillor King on that question too. But Taylor, I want to ask you for people for I guess people who are going into the housing market, and Megan just talked about intensification, filling up the of course near transit station in the urban area with more intensified developments. Do you find people these days, especially new prospective homeowners, are looking for a single family home with a backyard and a nice driveway, or are new home buyers willing to move into an intensified development, maybe something that's high off the ground, not at the at grade level? Are they willing to move into those high rise type developments?
I really think it's going to be so dependent on the person, on their situation. You know, for someone, multi-generational living might be the priority. For someone, it might be access to transit. They want to live downtown, and they recognize that, you know, getting into somewhere affordable, where they can access transit, where they can walk to a lot to everything. You know, that often means moving into a condo. For other people, the priority continues to be that, you know, more traditional vision of a single family home with your own backyard where you can fit your two cars in the driveway, and you want to live in the suburbs. And for others, you know, it's, I think that there is an interest as well in, and we see it in the platforms, like in some of the various party platforms, there's recognition of kind of different housing models that maybe haven't received the attention in the last number of years that they are now. You know, there's talk about co-ops happening quite a bit. We see some of the parties talking about co-ownership, co-investment models, helping people age in place, looking at multi-generational options. So I really do think that reflects the fact that that housing need is very, very individual. And I think for most people, it's just the bottom line, though, is I need to be able to afford the place that I'm living. That's a priority, and you know, it being safe and checking off some of those really important boxes.
Councillor King, what would your constituents think about the provincial government ordering intensification on all streets, essentially, where perhaps a single family home now might be, as of right, be allowed to go up to 2 stories, maybe 4 units or something like that? Do your residents appreciate any kind of that top-down ordering to when it comes to zoning from the provincial government?
Not at all. My residents expect local control over development. And it doesn't mean that they are opposed writ large against intensification. That's not the case. And I've had many conversations with both residents, community organizations, community associations within my ward and throughout the city. And we know that they're not against intensification. What they want to see is densification that suits the character of neighborhoods and is appropriately cited. So, you know, I don't think that the province has given us the tools. When I was elected in 2019, I know that one of the first items we were dealing with was Bill 108, the More Homes, More Choices Act. What's interesting is that, you know, it doesn't seem that we have more homes or more choice. And that piece of legislation really looked at limiting inclusionary zoning to transit-oriented development areas, to a specific radius around transit stations. I'm certain most municipalities, many councillors and many mayors in municipalities across Ontario would want to ensure that we expand the power of the municipality to locate intensification all throughout a municipality. The issue, of course, is having those real discussions about how to do that appropriately. And so I would argue that there is nuance here. That most people do want to see intensification, especially around transit priority areas, and they want to see different typologies of homes. So 3 or 4 bedroom homes that we can't compel in apartment type settings. But the reality, of course, is that what we've heard from the community is that they want to see more local control, not to be obstructionist, but to ensure that you know, we're building communities by communities.
Megan, what do you think? Do you think that right now residents just have to accept that their neighborhood is going to change if we want to increase the supply, especially if we're talking about intensification?
Wow, that's a hot one, John. I do. I really do. And I think, you know, if you're talking to the experts, you know, sometimes these conversations, and maybe I'll zero in on Councillor King's comment a little bit too, because, you know, I can respect the idea that people want to have the character of their neighborhood retained. And sometimes I think we have to ask, is this a question about character, or is this a question about, you know, kind of shrouding NIMBY concerns in the idea of character or heritage, right? We see these things come up, and I listen to all kinds of public meetings where neighbors are complaining about everything from an 8-story apartment building recently in London, we had a huge backlash against a two-story townhome development, right? I mean, you cannot tell me that that changes the character of your neighborhood. Two-story townhomes, and you asked earlier, John. You know what's the attitude, right? Are we coming along with this shift in density, or are we fighting against where people want to live and what they want? So I think it's going to be an interesting discussion. It's not going to be an easy road, but the reality of this is, you know, if people who are living in these established neighborhoods who have stable housing want their children to be able to also have that stable, secure, affordable housing, you know, if they want their paramedics and their teachers and the waitresses at your nearest, you know, bar and grill to be able to afford to live there and work in your community, this is something that we're going to have to accept, you know, different forms of housing, higher density housing, and obviously there should be choice, and I do really agree with Councillor King, there is nuance here. It's not cookie cutter. You can't have the same type of development everywhere and in every community, but you know, generally speaking, we're all going to have to get on board with some higher density, and I see it in my own neighborhood. That's not always an easy thing to accept.
Taylor, I'm going to put you on the spot a bit here, but you've gone through the campaigns. Which party do you think right now is pitching the most, I guess, aggressive policies when it comes to housing?
Ooh, that depends what kind of housing we're talking about, I think. Um, there is a bit of a sense when you look at. I'll start with it with the PC proposals because you know, as I mentioned earlier, there isn't a new for the election platform released yet. It hasn't been confirmed to me if that is in fact going to be happening. But the focus is really on that increasing supply. That's the very clear kind of predominant theme throughout a lot of the proposals that the PCs are putting forwards. With the Liberals, the Ontario Liberals and the NDP, they've really tried to address a lot of aspects of the housing market, from, you know, looking at reforming rent control, which is something that a lot of renters have been interested in and a lot of advocates have been calling for. You see attention to focus on housing first as a model for homelessness and supportive housing, and funding that. You see again talk around making changes to zoning to get more housing built as of right, different types of housing, addressing some of that idea of the missing middle. And again, the PCs, they're coming in having governed and being and investing in different areas. So they're highlighting some of the things that they have been doing, but that we're not seeing the same level of these are the new policies and new things we're proposing in all of these different areas. And the Greens have done some interesting things as well. You know, we've seen the proposal of a 20% tax on people who own multiple properties, and that isn't, you know, we're not talking just foreign investors here, we're talking domestic investors as well. So really it's difficult to say whose is the most aggressive or going to be the most effective, because there's so much going on in really all of these platforms, and yeah, you know, changes to one area, like there's a tie into other parts of the housing system and the housing spectrum. So it's really just, I think people will think, what are my priorities? And then they'll be able to look at what each of the parties is putting forward and think, you know, is that reflected in there or not?
Councillor King, I'm going to give the final word to you. I'll ask this. If we were to convene this panel again at this time next year, do you think that the housing situation in the province will have improved? That is, perhaps first-time homebuyers will be able to enter the market with greater ease. And to your point, perhaps the provincial government may have provided more opportunities to build social housing, offer maybe operating subsidies to housing providers. Look in your crystal ball, and what are you seeing in a year from now?
Well, in my estimation, we would need more than a year to move policies around housing and to see their effects, because there has been just so much neglect on this area for many decades. So I can't imagine that we would see substantive change unless we see real differences in terms of our economic situation and conditions. I think the reality for me is, and for many councillors in municipalities, is that we want to see real investments in public housing. I think that you can really start to address a lot of the challenges in communities when you ensure that people have a safe place to live. I think that it's important in our community because we're estimating at Ottawa Community Housing that we to really provide 10,000 units over 10 years, we need $100 million of investment per year. So when you start thinking about those types of numbers, the hodgepodge policies that we see being, touted by the major political parties in this election, I don't think will really address the specific challenges that we have. The other fear that I have around some of the policies that have been introduced is that they might simply add fuel to the fire. They might continue to really see the asset housing as an asset increase and to continue to balloon this bubble. I want to be optimistic, but the reality is, in terms of many of the policies that have been proposed, I don't see clarity in terms of a specific approach that would ensure that municipalities will see real change. And I personally think, since we're not seeing it on the fiscal side from government, we're going to be at basically captive to the macroeconomic conditions, and it might be interest rate fluctuations that determine affordability of homes. And we're already seeing decreases in terms of prices in certain markets, not just in Ontario but across the country. So if we continue to neglect our fiscal responsibilities as governments, I think we're going to be more at risk in terms of the fluctuating macroeconomic conditions that will impact housing. So I'm not optimistic, but I am happy to stand corrected a year from now.
Well, there's still some time left in the campaign. Maybe we'll see that clarity that you talk about, Councillor King. That's all the time we have today for this panel. Thank you so much, Rawlson King, Megan Stacey, Taylor Blewett. The Ontario election is June 2nd, and watch for all the coverage in the Post Media newspapers. Thanks for joining us, everyone.